A couple of days ago, Red announced the first cameras with Nikon Z mount. And personally, I think this is an incredibly exciting announcement. Of course, it's hardly a surprise that it happened, since Nikon bought Red last year. It was pretty obvious that sooner or later we'll see both Red cameras with Nikon Z mount and some form or some implementation of Red technology in Nikon cameras, and potentially at some point a much closer Nikon Red hybrid. So the fact that those cameras were released, it's hardly surprising, but what is surprising is how quickly it happened. It's been only about 8, maybe 10 months since Nikon actually acquired Red. To see those cameras so soon, it's really exciting. I thought it would be late 2025, possibly early 2026 when it will actually happen. And yeah, it's been only a few months and these cameras are already here, and they are actually straight away available to order. From my point of view, there are two main reasons why this is really exciting announcement. Well, first of all, it kind of gives us an indication of how the partnership between Nikon and Red is going to look like. Last year, a lot of people were concerned when Nikon purchased Red because, well, Nikon was not really seen as being particularly invested in video cameras or digital cinema. They do actually have a history of making cinema lenses, and ironically enough, they were the first company that introduced video in DSLRs back when D90 came out. But then they didn't really capitalize on that. It was Canon who took a lead, and then Sony with mirrorless cameras. And in fact, majority of my 17-year-old career, I was shooting on Nikon cameras, mainly back in my photography days. But then about 2 years ago, I switched to Sony, mainly because of the fact that I was planning to shoot more video. And Nikon, even those 2 years ago, wasn't really seen as one of the main video brands, right? Like in terms of stills photography, their cameras were great. They were always my favorites in terms of ergonomics. Color science is good, maybe not quite as nice as Canon's, but it's still good, better than Sony. But in terms of video features, well, that always seemed a little bit like an afterthought when it comes to Nikon. And more importantly, even those 2 years ago, or a little bit more than that, there wasn't as much support when it comes to third-party accessories. So if you wanted to get a cage for your camera, or I don't know, you wanted new LUTs, or you're expecting software support, third-party software support, or anything like that, well, you knew that Sony will be supported, Canon will be supported, but Nikon was probably somewhere quite far down the pecking order, right? So if you were interested in video, well, Nikon wasn't really the camera of choice. Now, when they bought Red, I think that shifted quite a bit. And of course, that's why people were concerned, because, well, it seemed a bit like a weird move for Nikon. But it looks like this partnership actually works really, really well. And what's really interesting for me is the fact that Nikon Z mount is actually the most flexible mount you can currently get. If you compare it to all other mounts, it has the widest diameter and the shortest flange distance, which basically means that you can adapt pretty much any lens, any other mount to Nikon Z mount, right? That's one of the big restrictions currently with Canon RF mount on Red cameras. That, for example, you cannot use any of the Sony lenses because flange distance is larger than Sony's. So not only Z mount on Red will enable you to use, well, obviously Nikon Z lenses, but pretty much any other lens via an adapter. Well, this is huge news for anyone who's currently in Sony ecosystem, right? Because you can potentially use all your Sony glass on Red. How well autofocus will work, of course, remains to be seen, and there are many other questions there, but at least the possibility is there. The second thing is, actually now it's possible that Red cameras will have really solid autofocus. Yes, it was possible to use autofocus with RF lenses, but the relationship between Red and Canon was completely different. They licensed the mount from Canon, and Canon, of course, has their own line of high-end cinema cameras and cinema lenses. Partnership between Red and Nikon is completely different because, well, Nikon owns Red, so it is in their interest for that company to perform as good as possible, and also Nikon doesn't have their own cinema cameras. So it makes perfect sense that Nikon cameras go up to a certain level, and then if you want to go above that, you get a Red if you want those absolutely top-end video features. From what I've seen so far, and the information at the moment is of course quite limited, but there are some videos already that were published by Red, and there's a really good video that was published by CVP that cover a lot of information, contains some very initial early tests of how well, for example, autofocus works on Z-mount Red cameras. And so far it looks like there is an improvement. It's probably not as big as some people may expect it, but it's fair to assume that this will keep improving. And what's nice to see is that Nikon is not completely getting rid of RF mount in Red cameras. Those RF mount Reds will be still available, and actually some of the AF improvements will trickle down via firmware updates to RF mount Reds as well. But let's be honest, the reality is that the future are Z-mount Reds, because I'm sure that this partnership between Nikon and Red will be really close, and they'll be really improving how well those cameras work. And from my perspective, well, Red Komodo X is just about a perfect camera. I've been using one for a few months. It's actually sitting on a shelf over there. Even though I'm mainly Sony shooter, well, I really enjoy using Komodo, but one of the reasons that I don't use it more is because I cannot rely on autofocus in this camera. If Nikon can make autofocus in Reds working almost as well as in their own mirrorless cameras, which I think at some point will be possible, that would be a huge upgrade. Then basically the only thing missing from Komodo, at least in my opinion, from it being a perfect camera, will be just lack of NDs, built-in NDs. But other than that, it will be a really solid package. So yeah, it's really interesting to see what will happen next. Personally, I think that Z-mount Komodo X plus Nikon Z6 Mark III or Z8, depending on your needs, is pretty much a perfect combo for almost any scenario, at least for the type of work I do. Even though I've been using mainly Sony cameras for the last couple of years, well, since Z6 Mark III came out, I've been thinking about potentially going back to Nikon at some point, because this camera just has such a perfect set of features, including internal RAW. And now you can also apply Red color science to that internal RAW. You can match Red and Nikon RAW closer in post. Of course, they are not the same, and certainly Nikon doesn't shoot Red RAW, and it's not 16-bit and so on. But there is a reasonably close match there. So what are your thoughts about this partnership between Nikon and Red and Z-mount cameras? Do you think it will be a big improvement and it will help Nikon to become much bigger player on the video space, or do you think that, well, doesn't really matter? Sony and Canon are so established that it will take years before anyone would be interested in switching to that system. Let me know in the comments.